Thanks, Luke. Yeah, and thank you to all of the speakers. There have been loads, and I've tried to keep up, and I've tried to make some notes and collect a few together and find some similarities. So I hope I pick up on questions that people have had, and if not, feel free to get in touch with our speakers and follow up and have more discussion. I thought maybe a good place to start, well, maybe I'll start easy because I've got a couple of clarifying questions for Rachel, if I may. John was wondering about, oh no, you answered that in the chat. And I think we spoke about how strong the correlation is between deprivation and low car ownership. But in terms of interpreting the figure, the circle diagram that you had, Rachel, does that a circle that's twice the size, is that twice as, does that imply double the number of LTNs, I think is what we're asking?
Yes, but not number of LTNs, but number of people covered, yeah.
Yes, oh yeah, exactly, thank you. Okay, so yeah, a large double, the circles are proportionate to each other, I guess is what we're saying there. Yeah. Okay. And then I think that's the clarifying question I wanted to just get out of the way. In terms of some bigger questions then, a few people have asked, and maybe it's a good place to start with yourself, Rachel, about the kind of equity questions that you were exploring, and how and whether you've been able to translate that to look at the justifications or the reasons given for some of those boroughs that were in your, if I'm remembering correctly, top right-hand corner, versus those that might be in the bottom left, whether they were, how well they communicated about their priorities or why they've chosen these areas, and whether equity features in that justification that they're giving.
I mean, that is an amazingly important question. It's something we sort of looked at a bit, but we would love to have a chance to look at more. I mean, I think one thing that worth saying is that potentially there are different things that the districts are trying to do, and that there may be different ways of interpreting equity. So just to give you one example, one district that came out as looking not very equitable, where they'd put their LTNs were right near some new cycle tracks on main roads, which were in less deprived areas. So although they didn't do very well for equity in relation to deprivation, you could say, well, it's equitable in relation to road type because the main road got the cycle tracks and the adjacent LTNs got the adjacent neighbourhoods got the LTN. So I think there's different kind of potential ways in which we could view equity, and I think it's important to kind of monitor more than what we looked at. But yeah, it's important. One also think very quickly is that Transport for London, in asking authorities to prioritise areas for low traffic neighbourhoods, explicitly included deprivation as one of its criteria, which I thought was quite interesting and which isn't necessarily always done.
Yeah. Okay, so it's important to not just label all of the boroughs in the bottom left as on the naughty step.
I think that's a reasonable point. Plus, this was a snapshot in time, and certainly another borough basically had put in LTNs in places where plans were already underway, and the ones that they've done since then, are in much more deprived areas. So it is a moving picture as well.
Yeah. That actually relates to a question I was going to ask Sally about sort of understanding a definition of gentrification, and the way that you were kind of trying to see whether in these changes and finding that you didn't think gentrification had been occurring, how you defined what we're thinking of when we say gentrification.
Yeah, I probably didn't really explain this clearly enough, but I mean, gentrification is usually the process by which less well-off residents are displaced by wealthier residents, and the low traffic neighbourhoods, environmental areas was very much associated in housing literature. There is a critique of it in the 70s as a sort of one of the causes of being instrumental in causing gentrification, particularly in London. But actually that process of gentrification doesn't happen everywhere, and certainly in Newcastle it was almost the opposite places actually became, went downhill dramatically. But equally, this is then quite a sensitive thing to talk about. Somebody did get in touch with me a while ago to say, oh, this image you'd found of people fighting over, street closures in the West End, can I use this for something? And I said, well, just, you have to be sensitive to context, because the people in these areas underwent decades of, being really let down in terms of housing, and the kind of planning processes that caused huge amounts of actual displacement rather than gentrification. So yeah, I mean, the end result can be the same in that some people are moved, but actually some people are stuck in these areas. They can't move, and they are surrounded by kind of half demolished houses, and a lot of their sort of local amenities have been taken out. So there's a sort of sensitivity around how we talk about some of the street changes, and certainly it has been argued that there were an incentive in some places, that particularly in London, that this did happen, that there were an incentive for people to come in and buy houses and do them up, and wealthy residents move in. But in other places, I would argue in Newcastle, there's no connection between what happened in terms of traffic reduction and what happened in terms of housing, although they have been associated, and they were associating through this sort of the 1969 Housing Act. The impact, there isn't a relationship between what happened with the housing and what happened with the environmental aspects of it.
Yeah, it's a really, I guess, important point to remember, that, like you say, the displacement might be still happening, but it's by different means and with different results, and therefore with different experiences for those who are displaced and not displaced, depending on the scenario. I guess maybe a wider question to kind of to the panel as a whole, about like potential conflicts between different groups. And I thought it's interesting to know, maybe across all of you, how the different sorts of conflicts you might be seeing in your research. I was thinking about some of the stuff you said, Sally, about the way that children and their play and their kind of right just to be outside is kind of potentially demonized, and so there's a kind of conflict there between like adults who fancy a neat street versus the children themselves, or maybe the parents of those children who want them to be able to play. So, but also conflicts, as we know in contemporary LTN debates, between different users and different residents or non-residents. So I don't know if anyone wants to jump in. Maybe I'll come to Harry and Graham, given that you haven't spoken yet, and then we'll go back round the panel.
Do you have anything you want to say about that, Graham?
I'll let you go first.
Yeah, it's really hard. I think we found in ours, so the kind of the perception of walking and cycling, and that actually the conflict is very different to kind of the public perception of the conflict. And there's a lot of people talking about the role of social media within that as well, and lockdown, that people have been sitting at home, they've perhaps become more engaged within their community, but then because a lot of the events have had to go online and the discussions are online as well. For example, in a tweet, there's only so much you can say, and it kind of, the problem with Twitter is there's only so much you can say, but also because of the algorithms, you generally get quite a narrow range of who you're seeing as well. So it sediments your position perhaps. And there's also people saying, I had a lot of time, so I'm sitting at home and I'm on Facebook, like, oh, the drama. So that is not helpful. It's not particularly helpful, and people can't get in a room and have these discussions face to face. And I'm sure on social media, people say a lot more than they would say if they were talking to someone in person.
I think it's really interesting, isn't it, the way people perceive who these developments are for and who should have an opinion on them. And this whole, as Harry was mentioning in the presentation, that is, about thinking it's for people who cycle, for cyclists, then that brings up a certain picture in people's mind, and they're thinking, oh, well, this is for relatively affluent people who cycle a lot in our neighbourhood, rather than thinking this is something about social inclusion. So that whole image of cycling probably plays out in how people then see the plans for their neighbourhood.
Yeah, can I come in on that? I think our experience in Newcastle with kind of recent modal filters that have been introduced is sort of along the same lines, that but actually that we've seen children playing in some of these places, and that's been used to argue against them, because they're not supposed to be for that. They're supposed to be for people who are cycling and walking, and you know, and there have been people who are campaigning against them, using the fact that there might be children hanging out there, or you know, that's either is dangerous, or they, you know, it's antisocial behaviour. So we've seen that quite a lot. So I think, you know, a bit of thought has to go into, you know, I think people use these kind of prescriptive ideas that are set out in sort of the reasons why we want this to happen. If you don't include things, then everybody's going, oh, well, they shouldn't be doing that, or they, you know. So yeah, I think it is kind of part of that whole discussion.
And Rachel, I don't know if you've got anything to add about some of the conflict that goes on.
Yeah, I mean, also again, a really, really interesting topic, and I just, one of the things that interests me about this kind of positioning as a cyclist intervention is the fact that we've, in our, I mean, this is in London, but in our research we found that in terms of walking and cycling, the increase in active travel tends to be mostly in walking, so they're actually having an impact on the levels of walking much more than on levels of cycling, which is maybe not that surprising when you think about it, because walking is often sort of shorter distance neighbourhood thing, whereas cycling requires those longer distance connections. But also some current analysis we're doing of injury data right now is suggesting that the injury benefit is particularly for pedestrians. But the other thing I wanted to say is, of course, there's other things that are going on, like around the way that news media reports and represents and so on. And I talked to quite a few journalists, and I'd had I often have quite in-depth conversations with them. One I was speaking to the other day, who I won't name, or the publication we were talking about, and I was saying, talking about these various results that we found and saying, well, provisionally encouraging, one context and so on. And we talked about it, and clearly he was quite, understood and was interested. And then he said, but the problem is my news desk just really wants a fight story. They wanted the culture wars. And I think this is quite a problem as well. It's not just social media, it is the traditional media and how they frame things means that you do get that. And, the piece when it was published was very much framed in that kind of fight terms.
Yeah. And in fact, a few of the other comments that are coming through on the chat about whether or not some of these conflicts that we understand or we see and we've kind of identified, whether they're quite often also kind of false kind of divisions between people, where the drivers are often parents who've got children who want, so like you say, the role of the media in shaping it, even whether the conflicts that we perceive, whether they're really as straightforward, but we like a fight story in the media. I guess I'm wondering also from some of the other questions about how, and I think it ties all three of your presentations together, about this idea that Harry mentioned towards the end of her talk about whether or not LTNs represent an incomplete kind of intervention, and the different uses, the idea of you're controlling through vehicle traffic but we're still allowing through cycle traffic, or are we increasing pedestrians, how are we managing pavement parking and as regards older people or wheelchair users, so all of these, the kind of wider solutions. And I wondered about, Sally, some of the historical kind of the environmental solution, trying to go beyond the building and look at the wider environment. Whether how we're positioning LTNs now, and maybe a historical kind of perspective on how we've been having this similar conversation, at least since the 70s, it sounds like. Yeah, how does this feature as part of the a wider, more complete reallocation or reimagination of our neighbourhoods? So another enormous question. I don't know if anyone wants to volunteer to offer some thoughts on the completeness, or
I can start with that. And actually it's really interesting hearing the research that Harriet and Graham have been doing, because I think in a way, what they did do in the 70s is they did these really kind of complete schemes, and actually walking around, there's road closures, there's benches, there's planters, there's play equipment, there's the works. There's continuous pavements, and actually it's quite a pleasant environment to walk around. But to get that point, I think you could see from what I'd shown from the 60s that complete plan, if you're so kind of fixed to that perfection, can take a very, very long time to deliver. And so I do think that the kind of getting in very fast and getting the sort of traffic movements first, and then working on some of the other stuff is probably, for now, a better way to do it. And also thinking about that historic environmental areas, they started off being a bit about walking, but that did fall by the wayside, and they're not about movement and sort of walking and cycling. And I think that element is, now we've sort of perhaps slightly gone too much the other way. It's very much about, it does facilitate cycling, it's a bit better for walking and does increase walking, but it's perhaps not the detail isn't there to make it sort of environment much better for everybody. And yes, on we have these very difficult, very long streets which might have very little traffic, but they're very long, they're very straight, they're very wide, and people drive very fast. And so some of the things that were introduced in the 70s, kind of parking build outs and trees and all the rest of it, do make a bit of a difference, that kind of thing.
I think if I'll come in there, because I want to build on what Sally was saying, is that we've also found a lot in the discussions, because monitoring and evaluation is coming through as a really important aspect for people living in the active neighbourhoods areas. But actually, in terms of the research that exists, it's very quantitative. So what that does is, when people want to know the impact of their active or what the potential impact could be, they're looking at the research from London, and this actually limits people's perceptions of what an active neighbourhood could be, because by looking at that research, they're automatically basically looking at pollution levels and car levels, and maybe a bit of walking and cycling data as well, which, whilst quite comprehensive, it does kind of narrow the view of what it can be, and it becomes just about those things rather than about people playing in the street, about experience. And actually what we had within one of our areas is it actually got labelled as a low traffic neighbourhood rather than an active neighbourhood. No one I spoke to even realised that it was about active travel even, or children playing in the street. They kept referring to it as traffic redistribution, and they were only understanding it as traffic redistribution. But actually, if you looked at it in terms of other facilities that were being put in, it was much more about being in place. So they put in benches, there was a picnic area, there was going to be a children's play area on the road that was going to have some paintings, and it was going to have modal filters to stop cars being able to go over it at all. But for the residents, they completely, they didn't know that that's what it was all about. And the placemaking was there, but the connection to what it was supposed to be wasn't. So I think that's quite interesting as well, and it kind of comes a bit into the language, but sometimes I think the language is a bit semantics, but it's also about how we measure it and how people then perceive it.
I think if I can add, I think the idea of the kind of what did you call it? Sorry, the kind of complete plan, or the kind of completeness, is a big issue in the Greater Manchester context, because this is part of a kind of a much bigger plan for the B network. So there will be that kind of network of walking and cycling routes, and active neighbourhoods or low traffic neighbourhoods are part of that. But the sort of nature of the planning system is that sort of individual bits of the B network are being considered on their own as planning proposals. So it would be a real shame if sort of something like an active neighbourhood would be trialled and then abandoned because of some reaction, when it hadn't been experienced as part of that bigger network. And I think that's possibly a limitation of the planning system, I think. And one of the things that really brought that home to me is one of the observations we had speaking to a disabled person living in one of the areas who couldn't use the train because the local train station is not accessible. There's an ongoing plan to make that accessible, but for the moment any added journey time is a real inconvenience. Even if that person would like to use a train, they actually can't. But in a few years' time, hopefully that'll be more possible. So it's sort of seeing that change gradually happening over a longer time and over a bigger area.
Yeah, I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Rachel.
No, just, I mean, really, really interesting and important points in the chat and by the rest of the panel. I mean, the point about what we measure and what counts is such an important one. It's one that we're all constantly, I guess, struggling against. And the analysis that we've done has used, it's been analysis that we've tried to do quite quickly with available secondary data, and that data covers some things and not others. But we're also exploring, looking at a range of other things. So like being able to capture changes in diversity of who's walking and cycling, and also where they're walking and cycling, like on the footway versus on the carriageway, and potentially looking at independent mobility and a way to measure that, dwell time. So I think, and also, qualitative research is so important too, and seeing how people experience these things. So there's an awful lot more research is needed, and also the point about providing the stuff. It's not just it shouldn't just be taking something away. It should be providing benches, opportunities for socialization and so on. And that's something that, to be fair, during COVID times, it was kind of hard to do some of those things that I think would have helped in London. But, if you look at the example of Barcelona, where there's potential, intersections where motor vehicles have been removed or reduced, have been turned into, informal cinemas, restaurants, sports areas, and so on. Those kind of things where people, potentially from outside that immediate area feel like it's a new facility that they can use. I think that is potentially quite helpful, but wasn't exactly easy to do in June 2020, but maybe it's something that could be learned from going forward.
Yeah, and actually that kind of connects to a question that somebody in the chat was talking about, this phrase that we quite often hear, I suppose, that perfect can be the enemy of good. And if we're accepting that a low traffic neighborhood is maybe as kind of understood differently and interpreted differently in different settings, and then, like you say, in Barcelona can be so much more in some ways. I wonder if there's the way that we had to introduce quite a lot of these, and I'm not sure the proportion of the London ones that were done, they're ahead of the rest of some areas in the country, aren't they? So how many of the London ones predate this? But I think a lot of them are COVID introductions. So, and I know certainly in Manchester we've had a few issues with the speed at which some have been introduced. So do we think the kind of that idea that we can experiment with reorganizing our neighborhoods, is that proving a successful experiment, or are we kind of realizing that some of the speed or the ability to consult, not even necessarily without through a lack of sort of trying, but just a difficulty during COVID, how that experimentation has played out in the experience of LCNs?
I think from the Greater Manchester perspective, so of our studies, the Bury one and Trinity were paid for with emergency active travel funding. So Salford Trinity fits more within their plans anyway, whereas the one in Bury came a bit more out of the blue. So you do see that people are a bit more kind of confused in how it connects in terms of that funding. And I had something else to say, but I forgot your question.
No, I mean, I think that's a really that's a nice example from Greater Manchester. I don't know if any of the other panelists have any thoughts.
Oh no, I did have one other thing to quickly say, is that so they are 6-month trials, and then the idea that they're an experiment, I had a very different idea of what they meant, what an experiment was meant by, but I think because of the traffic regulation orders, it's actually a lot more complicated for it to be an experiment than it is. So if you need to adjust something, it's up to the Highways Department to interpret whether the adjustment works within the traffic regulation order, or whether that adjustment would mean that the traffic regulation order has to be run again, and it's another 6 months, which means that potentially when they're posited as a trial, that's actually different from experiment, and they're not as adaptable within that as we need them to be for it to be a success, to say, okay, it's quite a clumsy solution to this kind of wicked problem, but because it's adaptable, we can do that.
Right, yeah. I don't know if anybody else has any other thoughts on the kind of that flexibility or experimentation.
Only to say that many of the general improvement areas, they used experimental traffic orders as well for when they were closing streets. I haven't found much evidence that they were altered, but they would go in exactly the same process, 6 months consultation, and then they'd have to make it permanent within a year. So whether that was also used to try and make people feel, you know, because they could have just put them in. There was no, I don't think there was any stipulation that you had to do it that way. So
right, that's interesting to know that the same approach is kind of carrying over. I know I'm conscious of time, and there's so many questions. I saw that a few people were asking about any potential guidance for advocates who might want to be kind of upskilling their local councillors or trying to convince them of the benefits of LTNs. I don't know if anyone can point anyone in a good direction towards that sort of information. Not sure. I'll let people think, and maybe someone can answer us in the chat. I'm sure someone knows. Also, in terms of terminology, I thought our final thoughts might try and put you all on the spot. There's a few comments coming in about whether the way that they get labelled as LTNs might focus on quite a kind of traffic reduction or even anti-traffic sort of anti-vehicle sort of stance, whether we've got better terminology that we might utilize or try and utilize. Anyone got any thoughts on a new and improved name for the LTN?
I'm just laughing because it's kind of recently somebody suggested to me that perhaps villages would be an uncontroversial term, and the villages was the term originally used in Waltham Forest that then became very controversial. And then, I mean, I think there are better terms, and I think maybe LTN isn't the best term, but I think it's worth remembering that these kind of interventions, however well they're done, you know, however they're described, you know, are likely never to be uncontroversial. So I mean, I guess, yeah.
Yeah. I think worth remembering, like how do we measure equity? There's never going to be one form of equity that kind of captures the whole thing, is there?
Yeah, and it's really hard. Oh, sorry.
I'm doing a terrible job of moderating. Sally, do you want to go first?
No, I was just going to say I completely agree with Rachel. I don't think it matters what you call them. It does matter what you do, though, and what you say you're going to do with them. Much more.
Yeah. Harry?
Yeah, and that we've seen in Greater Manchester that we've tried to call them active neighbourhoods in a lot of cases because of kind of the low traffic neighbourhoods are the popular term to refer to them, and that becomes used anyway. So it's also really hard to get away from that term now. But yeah, it's about what you do within that, and that is the most important thing.
Maybe we can apply the phrase perfect is the enemy of good to the terminology as well as the implementation itself. I think we best leave it there. It's 2 o'clock. I have lost track of the questions. My chat box now says I have 38 new chat messages since I last checked. So there's a lot of discussion. So I thank everybody for that, and thank our presenters again for 3 excellent presentations. It's been certainly one of our best. It is technically at the moment our last scheduled seminar. So you know, thanks for those who've been attending and to our newer attendees, but also watch this space for hopefully another series of seminars probably in the new academic year. You can kind of find out, keep up to date with what we're up to on Twitter at Active Cities UOS, or on our website, which I can post a link to in the chat. So yeah, please, there you go. I've added another message to a load of messages that I still also haven't read. So please do, yeah, check us out and follow along. And thank you to our speakers again, and to everyone for attending.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for coming, Sally and Rachel.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you.